My husband bruised my face and told everyone I was clumsy. He had no idea what was coming. Simone Garrett was 36 years old the first time her husband put his hand on her face, and she was 36 years old still when she decided, with the same quiet deliberateness that had defined every important decision of her life, that it would also be the last. She drove a used Buick with a dent in the rear bumper and worked as an intake coordinator at a nonprofit housing agency in Atlanta, which is what people saw when they looked at her. She wore her hair natural, and her clothes were clean and plain, and she did not talk much in rooms where she did not know everyone well. Marcus's friends called her reserved. Marcus told them she was shy. She had never once been shy in her life. What she had been was a staff sergeant in the United States Army for 8 years. Logistics and operations, 2 deployments, an honorable discharge, and a commendation she kept in a box in the back of the closet that Marcus had never thought to open. He put his hand on her face on a Friday evening in November. The bruise was the color of a storm system, and she went to work on Monday with it covered, and a story about a cabinet door. And her co-worker Phyllis looked at her for a long time and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that Simone had not already heard in her own head 100 times. What Marcus Garrett did not know, not once in 5 years of marriage, was what 8 years of military service had given her beyond the commendation in the box. He did not know about the $94,000 in a savings account he had never been told existed. He did not know the name of her attorney, or her commanding officer's brother, or what she had been building in the 14 months since the first time he had raised his voice, and she had recognized the sound of something she needed to document. He thought she was clumsy. What happened next would be the most precise thing she had ever executed. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The apartment on Ormond Street in Atlanta was on the 3rd floor of a building that had been renovated sometime in the 90s and not touched much since. And Simone had done what she always did with a space that needed attention. She had worked with what was there. The kitchen shelf she had reinforced herself with brackets she bought at the hardware store and installed on a Saturday morning while Marcus was still asleep. The curtains in the living room she had hemmed and rehung so they fell correctly, because the previous tenant had hung them high and they had never looked right. Small things, the kind of things that said this is mine and I am attending to it even when the larger situation was out of her control. She had a photograph on that shelf, between a small clay pot she had picked up at a market in Savannah and a mason jar she used for pens. Her grandfather, Walter Simone, she had been named for him on her mother's side, standing in front of the house he had built in Macon in 1962. Hand on his hip, squinting into the Georgia sun with the particular expression of a man who has just finished something that required everything he had and is not finished being proud of it. He had built the frame of that house himself over 2 summers, cutting and hauling and fitting with 2 men from his church and a set of borrowed tools, and the house was still standing. Her mother had grown up in it. Simone had spent every summer there until she was 17, and she knew the sound of that house. The groan of the second porch step, the way the kitchen screen door caught in the August heat. The way she knew her own breathing. He had told her once, when she was 11 years old and furious about something she could no longer name, sitting on that second porch step with her arms crossed and her jaw set, "Baby, you do not raise your voice when you are serious. Noise is for people who don't know what they're doing. The ones who know what they're doing go quiet, and they stay quiet, and they do the work." She had taken that into the Army with her. She had taken it into every room she had occupied since. She had been 30 years old when she came back from her second deployment, honorably discharged, carrying 8 years of logistics and operations experience and a commendation that cited her specifically for maintaining unit cohesion. and operational precision under conditions that the citation described in language that was careful and military and did not fully convey what those conditions had actually required of her. She had put the commendation in a box on the top shelf of the closet and gone back to living. She had met Marcus at a neighborhood block party that August, a gathering in the parking lot behind a church on Westview Drive. He was a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm, and he carried himself with the easy authority of a man who was accustomed to being the most capable person in most rooms he entered. He had a laugh that came readily, and he found her in the crowd with the kind of focused attention that felt, at the time, like recognition. He had been attentive in the early years, in all the ways that matter before you learn which ways are chosen and which are natural. He brought her coffee on weekend mornings. He was present when she needed him to be present. He met her colleagues at the housing agency with warmth and asked good questions and made the right impression. And for 2 years she had believed that impression was the man. She met his friends and watched him in those rooms, the way he held the center of a conversation, the way he redirected credit to himself so smoothly that you almost didn't notice it leaving someone else's hands, the way he laughed at things that were not quite jokes. She noticed all of it and told herself that noticing was not the same as knowing, and that she did not yet know enough. By the 3rd year, she knew more. The voice came first, raised in a way that was startling before it became familiar, the way a house sound becomes ordinary by the 3rd or 4th time you hear it. Then the corrections, small ones, offered in company, delivered with a smile that made it impossible to object without looking difficult. Then the way he described her work to his colleagues. She does intake, paperwork and phones, community stuff. She had a caseload of 47 housing unstable families and had secured $2 million in federal grant funding in her 2nd year at the agency. He knew this. He chose what he described. Then, in the 4th year, his hand. She had stood very still in that moment, the way she had learned to stand in situations that required absolute clarity about what was happening and what her options were. She had looked at him with the same flat, assessing attention she had once used in the field when a situation had changed faster than anyone had planned for, and she had said, quietly, "You will not do that again." He had laughed. It was a short laugh, almost reflexive, as if the statement were too small to take seriously. She had gone to the bathroom. She had assessed the damage in the mirror with the detachment of a person taking inventory of a situation they had been trained to manage, and she had decided what the next step was. She took out her phone. She photographed the bruise. She noted the date and time in a document she created and stored in an account Marcus did not have access to. Then she went back to the kitchen and made dinner and did not say another word about it. Phyllis had noticed. That was what mattered. Phyllis Odom had worked at the housing agency for 14 years and had the kind of face that people read as warm and underestimated as sharp, which was a combination Simone had always respected. She had knocked on Simone's office door on the Monday after that Friday with a cup of coffee balanced in one hand and her own mug in the other, and she had set Simone's cup on the desk without being asked and sat down in the chair across from her without asking permission. "I'm not going to say a word about what I'm looking at," Phyllis said. "I know that's not what you need from me right now." She folded her hands in her lap. "What I am going to tell you is that my niece is a family law attorney with her own practice on Peachtree Road, and she handles protective orders and divorce cases, and she has been doing it for 11 years, and she is very good. Her name is Adrienne Cole." She set a card on the desk. "That is all I am going to say about it." Simone looked at the card. Small, clean navy lettering on a white background. She picked it up and set it beside her keyboard where she could see it. "Thank you, Phyllis," she said. Phyllis stood, picked up her own mug, and left without closing the door behind her, which was its own kind of kindness. An open door on a Monday morning meant the rest of the office moved normally around it, and no one had cause to look too hard. Simone worked through the morning. She took her lunch in the parking deck and called Adrienne Cole from her car with the windows up. Adrienne answered on the second ring. She did not begin with pleasantries. She asked 3 questions. How long the pattern had been occurring, how many documented incidents existed, and whether Simone had any records she could present. Simone told her 14 months of records. There was a pause that was not quite surprise, but was something adjacent to it. When you say records, Adrienne said. A written log with dates and times and descriptions, Simone said. Photographs that are time-stamped. 2 visits to an urgent care facility, each documented under a general complaint category. I was deliberate about not flagging the cause in the record until I was prepared for that information to exist in a system. And written statements from 2 people who observed incidents or their aftermath that I can place into a corroborated timeline. The pause this time was longer. Where did you learn to document like that? Adrienne asked. 8 years in the Army, Simone said. Logistics and operations. You document everything, especially the things you think you might need later. Adrienne made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was the sound of someone recalibrating their assessment of who they were speaking to. Come see me Thursday morning. 9 o'clock. I'll be there, Simone said. She sat in the parking deck for another few minutes after she hung up, with the engine idling and her hands in her lap, and she thought about the commendation in the box in the back of the closet. She thought about the $94,000 in the account Marcus did not know about, money she had been setting aside since before the marriage, not from deception but from a private and disciplined understanding, absorbed from her grandfather and confirmed by the Army, that a person who controls nothing else must always control her own financial ground. He had never asked. She had never volunteered. Preparation was the work. She had been preparing for longer than he knew. She drove to Macon that Saturday. Her mother's cousin, a man named Gerald, who had been the closest thing to an uncle she had after her grandfather passed, still lived in the house on Magnolia Street, the same house Walter Simone had built in 1962, with a second porch step that still groaned the same way it had when she was 11. Gerald was 73 years old, retired now for 6 years from 30 years on the magistrate bench in Bibb County. He had the measured quietness of a man who had spent 3 decades watching people tell versions of the truth in front of him, and had developed an ear for the difference between what was said and what was meant. He sat across from her at the kitchen table where she had done homework as a child, and she placed the documentation folder in front of him and watched him read. He read it completely. He did not comment until he reached the last page. When he looked up, he said, "The photographs establish the pattern clearly. The medical records corroborate the timeline without triggering anything premature. The witness statements are consistent with each other and with your log." He set the folder down with the deliberate care of someone who understood what it represented. "Adrienne Cole is filing in Fulton?" "Thursday morning," Simone said. "Good. She knows that court." He was quiet for a moment. "The financial picture. Does he know about the account?" "No. Does anyone?" "Adrienne does now. You do." He nodded slowly. "Your grandfather used to say that the person who controls the timing controls the outcome. He was talking about carpentry, about waiting for the right conditions before you set the final joint, but it applies to most things." He looked at her steadily. "You have controlled the timing. You have not moved too early. Don't move too early now." "I won't," she said. She stayed for dinner. Gerald made the same rice dish he had made every time she visited since she was a child, and they talked about the house and about her work. and about a documentary he had been watching about birds of the American Southeast, and neither of them talked about Marcus again that evening. It was enough to have said it once, clearly, to someone who understood its full weight. She drove back to Atlanta that night, and the following week she went home each day and made dinner and asked Marcus about his work, and answered his questions about hers, and maintained the surface of a life that was still intact. He was performing normal. She was performing normal. The difference was that she knew what she was doing. Adrienne had counseled her to wait until the morning of the filing before leaving the apartment. A departure too early could complicate the proceedings. A departure coordinated with the filing created a clean record, so Simone had packed a bag. Practical, the way she would have packed for a field exercise, taking only what was necessary and nothing that could not be replaced. And she had put it in the trunk of the Buick on a Sunday afternoon while Marcus was at a friend's house. And she had driven to the grocery and come back and made a meal and set the table and let the week pass. On Tuesday morning, she rose at her usual time. She showered and dressed and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window in the early light, and she looked at the mason jar of pens on the shelf and the photograph of her grandfather beside it, and she thought about the house in Macon, still standing after 60 years. Then she picked up the bag from the bedroom closet, the commendation in its box from the top shelf, because it was hers, and she had earned it, and she was finished leaving her things behind, and she walked out the door. The protective order petition was filed that morning in Fulton County, backed by 14 months of documentation, the photographic log, the medical records, the written statements from Phyllis and from a neighbor on the third floor named Dorothea, who had heard raised voices on 3 separate evenings and had written down each date because she had been raised by a woman who told her that a witness with no record is just an opinion. Adrienne filed the divorce petition at the same hour. The combination was deliberate. A protective order and a divorce filing landing simultaneously, supported by a document record that had been methodically constructed over more than a year, left very little ground for the kind of countermaneuvering that men like Marcus counted on when they assumed they had time. He had assumed Simone's quiet was passivity. He had not understood that it was the sound of preparation. Simone spent that evening at Phyllis's house. In the guest room Phyllis had turned down without being asked, and she sat on the edge of the bed with her laptop open and her folder beside her, and she was not afraid. She had been trained not to make decisions from fear. Fear was information. You received it. You noted it. You set it aside in favor of what the situation required. What the situation required now was to let the process she had built do what it was built to do. She had more patience than Marcus had ever given her credit for. The court date was 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning in December, in a courtroom on the 8th floor of the Fulton County Courthouse. The room smelled of floor cleaner and recycled air, and the winter light came through the high windows at an angle that fell short of the gallery benches. Simone arrived 15 minutes early with Adrienne and took her seat at the petitioner's table and set her folder on the surface in front of her and folded her hands over it and waited. Marcus arrived with an attorney he had retained the previous week, a man named Devlin, who wore a very good suit and moved through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had performed this particular function many times and expected the day to go a certain way. He did not look at Simone directly when he entered. That told her something. Marcus sat. His expression had been prepared. It was the expression of a man who had been wrongly accused and was troubled by it, grieved even. A man who wanted nothing more than to understand what had gone so terribly wrong between two people who had been happy together. She had seen that expression in her own kitchen, in her own living room, in the doorways of her own home. She knew every note of it. She looked straight ahead. Devlin's opening was polished and confident. He presented Marcus as a devoted husband whose wife was experiencing difficulties that had led her to make serious mischaracterizations of their home life. He used the word clumsy, attributed to Simone herself. He used the phrase private struggles. He was very good at the work he was doing, and the work was built on nothing at all. Adrienne waited until he sat. Then she stood, and she placed the documentation on the surface before the judge in a single organized stack, and she spoke for 9 minutes in the level tone of someone who does not need to raise her voice, because the facts speak at a sufficient volume on their own. She presented the photographs in dated sequence. She presented the medical records. She presented the log, 14 months of entries, precise and consistent, in Simone's own hand and confirmed by timestamp. She presented the written statements from Phyllis and Dorothea, 2 women who had seen and heard and written it down when they saw and heard it. The judge looked at the photographs. He looked at them for a long time. Devlin mounted a counter-narrative. Simone watched him from across the room and observed, with the calm assessment she had developed over 8 years of reading situations that required it, that he had been given a case with no evidentiary foundation and was doing his professional best with what he had, which was nothing except the argument that the woman sitting at the opposite table was someone other than what the record plainly showed her to be. Simone had spent 14 months building that record. It did not require her to defend it. The judge granted the protective order. Then, Adrienne said she had one additional matter to bring before the court as part of the divorce proceeding already on file, and she presented the financial disclosure that Simone had assembled from the marital records she was entitled to request. It showed that the apartment on Ormond Street, which Marcus had described in conversation as a shared asset and a shared financial responsibility, was in fact encumbered by a credit line he had opened against its equity without Simone's knowledge, against which he had drawn $38,000 over the previous 26 months. The proceeds had moved to an account in his name, only that Simone had been unaware of until the financial discovery process began. Devlin had not known about the credit line. She could see that from across the room. Whatever expression crossed his face lasted only a second. But a second was enough. Marcus's composure did not collapse. It just became slightly less precise, a small visible shift in the architecture of a performance that had, until this moment, held its shape. The judge noted the financial matter for the full divorce hearing and directed both parties to ensure complete financial disclosure by the date of the next proceeding. He confirmed that the protective order was in immediate effect, and that violation would be treated accordingly. Adrienne gathered her papers. Simone stood. She straightened the front of her blazer. She picked up her folder and her bag, and she turned and looked at Marcus Garrett one single time, with the same direct and level attention she had once used in situations that required her to see exactly what was in front of her, without adding to it or taking from it, and she said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said. The record said it. The judge had acknowledged the record. Everything that mattered had already been placed on the table and confirmed. She walked out. She did not look back. 11 months later, Simone Garrett was sitting on the small balcony of an apartment she had chosen herself in the West End neighborhood of Atlanta, with a cup of coffee and the particular quality of morning that comes in late October when the air has finally turned and everything smells clean. The Japanese magnolia in the courtyard below had dropped most of its leaves, and the branches made a clean pattern against the pale sky. Her grandfather's photograph was on the bookshelf inside. She had given the mason jar of pens its spot to the left of it, same as always. The divorce had been finalized in the spring. The financial settlement had included the full accounting of the $38. $00 credit line drawn against the marital home. and the court had ordered Marcus to make Simone whole for half of that amount, plus her legal costs, which were considerable, and which he was still paying in quarterly installments from wages that had diminished since his employer, a construction management firm where his professional reputation had been the primary asset he traded on, had declined to renew his contract following the protective order's public filing. He had moved into a rental in Cobb County. His sister had stopped returning Simone's name when it came up in conversation, which was its own kind of verdict. The protective order had been violated once, 7 weeks after it was granted, a message sent through a third party that Adrienne had flagged to the court the same afternoon. The judge had noted it. Marcus had been warned in terms that Adrienne described as unusually direct for that particular courtroom. He had not tried again. There was a man named Solomon who had been introduced to Simone through Gerald's youngest son, a college friend of his who now worked in housing policy with the city of Atlanta and had come to one of the agency's quarterly meetings in September. Solomon was measured and funny in a dry way that crept up on you, and he had asked her to dinner with a directness that reminded her of the kind of people she had respected in the military, people who said the thing they meant without dressing it up. They had been to dinner 3 times. She was in no hurry. Neither was he. That suited them both. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the magnolia tree below and let the morning settle around her. She had documented everything. She had controlled the timing. She had walked out of that courtroom and not looked back and built a life from the ground up, quietly, the way her grandfather had built the house in Macon board by board across 2 summers. It was still standing, so was she. Noise was for people who didn't know what they were doing. She had always known what she was doing. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.